Here we go. Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Thursday night conversation about all things World War II. We've been talking for past several weeks, months even, about Masters of the Air and the Air War over Europe. Glenn Flickinger is our host. I am just the wingman tonight, managing things here behind the scenes. My name is Todd DiPastino. I'm the executive director of the Veterans Breakfast Club, and this is our regular Veterans Breakfast Club program for Thursday night. And I want to thank you all for joining us. We've been creating these communities of listening, as we call them, since 2008. For 16 years, the Veterans Breakfast Club has been doing its thing. And the programs that we share kind of connect, heal, educate, and inspire. And they're only possible with your generous support. So we invite you to donate to the Veterans Breakfast Club. You can become a member of the Veterans Breakfast Club by going to veteransbreakfastclub.org. We would love to have you. And but tonight we want to jump right into the conversation. We have some wonderful guests who are very generous with their time, sharing stories of their parents who served in World War II. Glenn, why don't you introduce them for us?
Okay. Are you seeing me okay, by the way? Am I here?
Yeah, we see you. I mean,
there you are.
I don't see myself, which is kind of odd, but
yeah, I see you.
Okay.
I see.
The least photogenic person in the world, so I'd rather not see myself. Anyway, my name's Glenn Flickinger. I'm the host of Greatest Generation Live, member of the board of the Veterans Breakfast Club, and pleased that you're with us tonight. We're continuing our long series of programs now on Masters of the Air, following up the Masters of the Air Apple TV program. Everybody I think online knows this, but just in case there's some that are new to us. We've been doing these really since December when we first interviewed Don Miller. And since then, we've interviewed 3 or 4 vets of the 8th Air Force, of the Air War over Europe. And we've interviewed many experts, people that have written books about their loved ones' experience. And we just continue rolling along here. And we're going to get into a conversation tonight with a couple of people that I'll explain in a minute. But first, I want to introduce Marilyn Walton. Marilyn, say hello, please.
Hello.
Hey.
Hey.
Marilyn was the technical, how do I want to put it, Marilyn? Technical advisor to
consultant
to
technical advisor. Yeah.
Apple TV, worked with the top brass, let's say, with Roger Orloff, who we had on a couple of weeks ago.
John Orloff.
John Orloff.
Yeah.
And her area of incredible in-depth knowledge is the POW experience. And that's because her father was a POW. If I can get the right slide up here, there we go. And Marilyn, I wanted to put this book up here because I was looking at it to order the other day. And I thought, Rhapsody in Junk.
Great name.
Title stuns people, but
no, when I first looked at that before, I just automatically in my head thought Rhapsody in Blue,
Yeah, that's where they got the name for the plane, I think.
So
before
we get into our 2 other guests, just give us a little background on this book and what led you to write this.
First, Glenn, I want to say that we're not seeing your screen.
I am sorry. I totally skipped the step. Let me fix that. Okay. Todd, while I'm fixing that, which might take me a minute, do we have any World War II veterans on with us tonight?
We certainly do. We have the wonderful Julia Parsons with us. Julia, I failed to introduce you to our group the last time you were up. She's on, but I think she stepped. Oh, there she is. Hey, Julia, if you want to unmute, you could say hi to everybody. Julia, how are you?
I'm just fine, thank goodness.
I haven't talked
Hey,
with you in a long
Julia.
time.
I'm sorry.
I haven't talked with you in a long time.
I know nothing's been wrong.
Okay, good, good. Julia Parsons is a Navy veteran. She was a Navy wave in World War II. She turned 103 on March 2nd. She was a code breaker in World War II. She worked at the Naval Communications Annex in Washington, D.C., in what was called the Shark Division, decoding Enigma traffic that was going from, I believe, Berlin to U-boats in the North Atlantic. And her work was fascinating. She was not allowed to talk about it for decades, but she has been talking about it a lot lately. And we feel so blessed, Julia, that we've been allowed to kind of learn from you over these past several years at the Veterans Breakfast Club.
Well, thank you. And I certainly have been blessed to be so welcome. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. It got me through the pandemic, and that's a really good thing.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
So we are very honored to have you, Julia. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
Right.
And I see Colin Heaton on this evening.
Colin.
See ya. Jim Blakely, I see, who was on last week, did such a fantastic job, who we're going to have on again in the future. Nancy Putman is on as well. Thank you, Nancy. Todd, do we see Ed or Joe on this evening?
I do not see Ed or Joe on yet. I'll be keeping an eye out for them, however.
Well, they're interesting in that, I send them an email every week, and I'd say 2 out of 3 weeks, I get an email back that says something like, "Thanks, Glenn. I really would like to participate, but I'm busy traveling." Both these guys are 100+ years old.
Yeah.
Okay.
I also want to point out George Zwijkstra is with us. He's joining us from Nova Scotia. George, I think you have to say he served or he fought in the resistance, in the Dutch resistance, as a 10-year-old in World War II. He has a fascinating and sad story. Hey, George.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Hi. How are you?
Hi. I didn't want to surprise you,
George.
George, but I wanted to let people know that you were on. George has a fascinating story, and he shared just a bit of it with our magazine last year. We shared a wonderful story in our magazine that we shared. So I'll you know what, I think while you guys are talking, I'll try and find it online and put a link here in the chat, because it really is that moving and good. So thank you, George, for joining us. Okay.
This time I'm going to remember to hit the actual share button. So if you want to share, you have to hit the share button. Lesson I taught my children from an early age. Hit the share button. Okay, so Marilyn, this is what I intended to put up: Rhapsody in Junk, and the story of your return to Germany to figure out your father's story. So give us a quick debrief on that.
My father told me a good bit about the war, but not everything. And he got dementia later in life. And I just decided I wanted to know more and wanted to retrace his footsteps, which my husband and I did. Went back to England. He flew for the 458th. And it took me about 2 years to actually research and find his crash site in Germany. And we went back, and the Germans helped us go into the woods and dig out parts of the plane. And I was able to bring some home and put them in his hands about 2 weeks before he died.
Oh, wow.
So we went to the interrogation center. There's not much left of it anymore. Went to Moosburg, Stalag 7A, where they were all liberated. Went to Stalag Luft III, which looks a lot different now than it did when we went back. And that was about 2004 we went back. And we just traveled, just went in his footsteps. And it was very rewarding, I have to say. And I encourage other people to do it. And since I've done it, I've gotten emails from people and say, well, how do you find the crash site, that kind of thing. And a lot of that's in the book, how I did it. So
excellent, Marilyn. Thank you for that.
Thank you. My
Great.
sister's an artist and she actually drew the bombardier's wings on there on the top and the bottom.
Wow.
So she had her part in it too.
Great, nice family effort.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Marilyn, thank you again for all that you've done for us. And tonight we have two of what we call Marilyn's friends with us. And she's already introduced us to two others that we had earlier in the, actually last month now. And tonight we have two. One is Jim Keeffe. Jim, please say hello.
Hello,
Okay.
Jim Keeffe here from east of Seattle, about 30 miles. Good to be here. Thanks, Glenn.
It's a pleasure. And Jim's father was James Keeffe, B-24 pilot. Our mistake on the little announcement we put out and on the website. So B-24 pilot with the 389th Bomb Group. And we're going to go through his story first this evening. And it's an incredible story of courage and resilience, and still ends up in Stalag Luft III with so many of the other POWs we talked about. And then second tonight is Carol Godwin. Carol, please give us a
Good
wave.
evening. I'm honored to be with you tonight. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carol. And her father's story, Lieutenant William Carey.
Lieutenant.
Sorry, I almost made it. Lieutenant William Carey is also another fascinating story, and there's a feature of it that I had not heard about before this particular project, I'll call it for right now, that we'll learn about. But before we get to Jim, let me also mention that Carol is the niece of General Paul Tibbets. So Paul Tibbets was her uncle. Do I have that right, Carol?
Correct. My mother's brother married his sister. All in the family.
Yeah.
We'll need a chart on that someday.
Yeah, right.
But you knew Paul Tibbets as a relative.
Correct.
Did you know his history, his background?
Not really. Growing up, I didn't. I got to know him better in later life, but I was an Army spouse, so I was always off living somewhere else from where he was with family.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's just an interesting fact. He's one of the people I mention in just about every lecture I give on the air war over Europe. And he's somebody I'd love to speak on for an entire lecture if I ever had the chance. So is my screen still being shared, Todd?
No, I stopped it.
Okay. So let's put it back up and then we'll get into Jim's father's story here. Okay. Are we good now?
Oh,
Okay.
here we go.
Jim has actually written not two books, as this might look like, but one book about his father. Jim, you want to explain?
Yes. Back in 2010, finished writing and published a book called 2 Gold Coins and a Prayer about my father's journey as a shot down pilot. He evaded in the Netherlands for almost 5 months. And that's where the 2 gold coins part of the title comes from. He was given 2 Dutch gold guilders in exchange for the English pounds that he had in his wallet. And George, who you introduced earlier, being from the Netherlands, George, I want to tell you how much we appreciate the Dutch resistance and the Dutch civilians who helped my father and hundreds of other Allied airmen who ended up on the ground. And it became such an important part of the story of the Dutch that we ended up translating the book into Dutch. And just last March, 2 months ago, my wife and I flew over to the Netherlands and we launched the book, and it was just renamed Liberator Down. But the story is word for word as it was originally. And it was in honor and tribute to the Dutch for us doing that.
Excellent. Excellent. You've got to be very proud of that being translated into Dutch. And
yes. Yeah.
How's your Dutch?
Actually, zero.
Tough language.
Yeah. I've been over there several times, and just this coming weekend, May 4th and 5th, are their national holidays. For the 4th is their Memorial Day, and the 5th is the Day of Liberation. And I've been over there several times in the little town where my father parachuted down in South Holland called Papendrecht. I've had the honor of speaking during their Memorial Day services a couple times over the years. And so they will be doing that here in a few days.
Well, luckily, so many Dutch people speak English. Lucky for
Yes,
us.
thankfully.
I know this book well, and I recommended it to John Orloff for Masters of the Air. And I think Jim, you sent him a copy, right? Because there were some scenes he was considering from Jim's book to put in Masters of the Air. So there he is.
There's another handsome young 8th Air Force man.
Yeah, that was my father at a strapping age of 19 years old.
Wow.
He was a serious young fellow then, and he pretty much during his whole military career, he was serious minded, but he had a heart of gold underneath all that seriousness. And all the people he trained later in life in the ROTC and as commander at different weather stations during his Air Force career always had the highest regards for him because of his dedication and his strict military bearing, but his faithfulness to all the men under his command.
Any idea when this picture was taken? It's when you note here, it's when he was a U.S. Army cadet in basic.
Yeah, that's probably the beginning of 42.
Okay. And here he is in a training photo of some type.
Yes, their class of 42F. They were training to be fighter pilots, and at that period of the war, they were losing so many bomber crews that they shunted 42F over into bomber training. And so this is a training picture of him in the co-pilot seat of a B-24.
A little bit like the Lucky Luckadoo story where he was learning to fly B-25s, I think, and they moved the whole class over to be co-pilots of B-7.
Yeah. My dad wasn't really thrilled about that. He wanted to be a fighter pilot, but he goes, "You got a job to do, so we'll muscle this B-24 wherever we need to."
Yeah.
This is a picture of just some gunnery practice. The two right guys on the right. The first one is James MacArthur. He was the pilot of my dad's crew. It was the MacArthur crew, and my father is standing next to him in one of the air bases, probably in New Mexico. This is a classic picture of the back end of a B-24. You can see the machine gun trays where the belts take the ammunition to the tail gunner, and it's showing a crewman opening up the camera hatch in the back of the B-24 with two waist gunners behind him. And it's that camera hatch that plays a part in my father's story.
My dad went out through the camera hatch. I wasn't sure if yours did, but he jumped from the camera.
Yeah. And that's where the prayer part of the title comes in. When he got ready to bail out after getting the guys in the back end out, every cell in his body, the way he describes it, was screaming to get out, but a little quiet voice said he had time for a Hail Mary. So he waited a few seconds.
My dad did an Our Father.
Yeah.
Right there.
And you know, that put him a few hundred yards further down in his descent, that he ended up not landing in one of the Dutch rivers. Instead, he landed on dry land.
And as we talked about several times before with men bailing out, it was the first time they ever bailed out in a parachute. They never had any parachute training.
No, not at all.
Amazing, amazing. So your father arrives in England when, late in 43, early in 44?
November of 43. And he was assigned to the 389th, which is out in East Anglia near Norwich. And he flew 3 missions. And on the 4th mission is when as he said, they were shot up. He didn't like me saying they were shot down because they weren't. They were shot up so bad on a mission to Berlin on the 8th of March that they ended up losing fuel, and 2 engines were out, and they bailed out over Holland because they ran out of gas. This is a picture by a POW named James Jimmy Blackstock at Stalag Luft III. My father found out that he was an artist, and he asked if he would draw a picture of him bailing and parachuting out over the Dutch landscape. So that's depicting my father just pulling the D-ring with the parachute beginning to billow out by his feet there. And you can see the Dutch landscape with one of the rivers below.
Incredibly well done. I hope you have that in your possession.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Wow, that's a family heirloom forever.
That's a
Yes.
very dangerous body position to open a parachute. As a former military freefall parachutist, I can assure you that if you deploy that thing between your legs, you're doing a Hail Mary yourself.
Yeah. Well, he figures that Jimmy MacArthur circled the plane as they were bailing out, and they got lower and lower, and my father figures that he pulled the ripcord about 400 feet from the ground. He could see the wires on the telephone poles at that time. And it was an instantaneous pull the ripcord, smack it with the parachute open, and then he hit the ground.
And when he hit the ground, what happens?
Well, he landed in an apple tree and then bailed out of his harness and landed face first in the mud. And when he looked up, there were about 50 Dutch civilians. He was behind a house, and 50 Dutch civilians were accumulating there. It was behind this house right here, and he could still hear all the guns and anti-aircraft trying to shoot his plane because it was circling around at this time. And he hid in the rabbit hutch to the right side of that picture right there where the little windows are. And this picture was taken in 1959 when he went back to Holland. And those 2 Dutch men on the left are 2 Dutch men of the resistance that he stayed in touch with, and they retraced his steps in 1959. And that's when he began to find out what happened to many of the folks that had helped him during the war.
So he came down in an urban area?
Semi-urban. Papendrecht was a little village at the time, right off the river across from a larger city called Dordrecht, and it was all south of Rotterdam, about 20 miles. And so these homes were right on the inside of a dike, which is the land inside of a dike is called a polder. Yeah. And so that night, when he hid in the rabbit hutch, the owner of the house came down to feed the rabbits, and my dad presented himself. And the old man went to a local doctor and said, "I have an American pilot in my home. What the heck do I do?" And the doctor, his name was Dr. Rietveld, who was in the resistance, said, "Mr. Cordon, you go home. You don't know anything. There's no pilot there at all." So that evening, Dr. Rietveld got some resistance guys to come and take my dad in a rowboat across the river to the town of Dordrecht to this little place here. This is called Aardappelmarkt, which is apple market. Mm-hmm. And the safe house right smack, the black door right smack in the middle of that picture is number 9 Aardappelmarkt. And that was the first safe house he stayed at for 2 nights before other members of the resistance picked him up and they bicycled into Rotterdam, where he stayed for almost 5 months.
5 months.
Yeah.
And during that 5 months, what was he doing? Was he just hiding?
The fellow on the right here is Albert Bruckhausen, my father in the middle, and another Dutchman, Kees van den Engel. Both Bruckhausen and van den Engel were in the resistance, and Bruckhausen was a photographer. So he would make pictures for false identity cards for Jews or people in the resistance, and he made one for my father. And on the false ID card, they gave his name was Andrew Twee, and he was a deaf and dumb basket maker. And the purpose was that if he was ever stopped and asked for his ID, that he wouldn't have to talk. And he actually was stopped by an older policeman one time. It's a wonderful story. It's too long to get in here, but my father was caught after curfew, and one of the things he couldn't tolerate was staying indoors. And so he, with his false ID, he was out all the time mingling with the civilians, going with Case Fondenangle and other members of the resistance on different meetings and different little capers. And he was always during those weeks and months, drawing the military installations that were being put up around Rotterdam by the Germans. But one night he was out after curfew, and he was taking a little ferry boat across the Nord River, which runs through Rotterdam. And when it tied up to the walkway to get above the dike into the city, he saw a policeman underneath a street light. And he goes, "Oh my God, there's a policeman up there." So he walked up there, and the policeman asked him for his ID, and my dad gave it to him. And the policeman, he was in his 50s, and my dad was told back at the air base that if you run into civilians on the ground that are older, they probably hasn't been Nazified, and so they're probably decent people. And so the policeman looked at the ID card, and he's looking at a deaf and dumb basket maker who has a nice suit on and actually has rubber tires on the bicycle, which is unheard of back then because all the rubber had deteriorated by that time. And so he looked my dad up and down, and my dad thought, well, he's an old guy, he's got to be decent. And he says, yes, in Dutch, "Yes, sir, I'm a deaf and dumb basket maker." And the policeman looked over his shoulders, and he folded the card up and gave it to my dad and told him to go away. Wow. And that was the one time that he was asked for his ID.
Yeah.
Wow. Story.
Yeah.
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 So this is the apartment up on the third floor was owned by Mr. and Mrs. Anton Sanders. Anton Sanders was a suit maker, and so he's the one who my dad got some nice suits from. But the balcony there is their balcony, and this is taken during the war from a tennis court down below. But to the left of the balcony is another balcony with some shorts hanging over the rail, and a member of the SD, or the Zekerheitsdienst, had thrown the Dutch family out of that apartment and was living there. And so it was very tense whenever my father would come up into the Sanders home, knowing that there was an SD fella living next door. And one time he passed this very stern looking, highly decorated, uniformed Zekerheitsdienst coming up and down the stairs. And luckily nothing happened, but that was a very tense situation.
And he stayed here for 2 months.
He stayed there for 2 months, and he was actually soaked up in the shower when the Mrs. Sanders came running up the stairs, screaming and yelling. And my father thought that he had been caught, and so he ran out into the hallway all soaked up. And then he heard that she was saying, "The invasion has begun. The invasion has begun." And it was June 6th. It was the D-Day invasion that they just got word. And so he didn't have to go run and escape. He howled down. Now, this is Mr. Jappe Alberts. This man was killed in a reprisal killing. He was a dentist. He and his wife, Jackie, kept my father in their home for 2 months. And the Alberts were also holding a Jewish family in the attic for 3 years by the time my father showed up. And they would come out of the attic 3 times a day and have dinner and food and then go hide back up in the attic. But 9 months or a few months after my father was captured, the Germans, the Gestapo, hit the Alberts home, and they took the Alberts family to the local prisons, and they took the Jewish family to a holding camp up in North Holland. And the Germans were doing reprisal killings at the time, and they rounded up Mr. Alberts and 9 other fellas and took them out and murdered them at the town of Heinenoord, which is south of Rotterdam, in reprisal for the killing of a Dutch Nazi.
Wow.
Yeah, very, very, very brutal and sad. These are some other Dutch people my dad ran into. Samuel Eschmeyer, Johannes Verdorn, Marinus Vet, and Lingdart Velstar. The 2 men on the ends were both murdered by the Germans. Landart Velstar was the leader of the LKP, which is the fighting fist of the Dutch resistance. And very, very powerful man. My dad said when he came into the room, he exuded authority. But he lost his life, and Samuel Eschmeyer lost his life in a shootout with the Germans. The other 2 fellas that helped my father, Johannes Verdorn, survived the war, but Marinus Vet was captured and taken into Germany, and he died of typhus at Landshut just 2 days before the end of the war. Several others in the resistance, Potter Hanks.
Sorry.
That's
Sorry.
okay. Potter Hanks was a Catholic priest. Kaplan Hannen was a chaplain. They were both in the resistance. Johannes Berlijn, he was a chemist. He was a leader of the South Holland resistance. He died. He was murdered. But his expertise as a chemist was he could remove the J from Jewish Dutch ID cards, so they weren't Jewish anymore.
Ah, wow.
And then there was Kees van den Engel again, down on the lower left, with his new wife Marika. Right after the war, they were both in the resistance, and they had both been captured eventually and taken to slave labor camps, but they survived. This is Mr. and Mrs. Alberts again, and Mrs. Alberts survived the war. She came over and visited our family in the late 50s. And this little Jewish girl, Helen, was the daughter in the attic. And when I wrote my book back in 2010, when it came out, in 2011, I got an email saying, would you pass on to the author of this book that I was a little Jewish girl who was in the attic at the Alberts home during the war? And she told me that when I contacted her, she told me that the war had affected her whole life, obviously. She was almost 70 when she contacted me. And she said that her daughters said, Mom, it's time for you to close the circle. So let's Google the Jappe Alberts family and find out things. So they Googled the Jappe Alberts family. They found the memorial to Dr. Alberts where he was murdered. There's a big memorial in the countryside. And then they found a passage in my book on Google Books that talked about Dr. Alberts and the Jewish family in the attic. And she realized she was reading about herself.
Wow.
So long story short, she and her husband live in Israel. They were going to be in Chicago for a musical festival, and she flew over from there to Seattle and had a reunion with my father in about 2012. And it was very wonderful.
That is a wonderful story.
Wow.
Yeah, she's the only one left alive of the whole story. She's now about 88 years old.
Those are the best story. Those are the best stories of the war. The people that get saved, and the people that come back and have reunions.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
On the left is Theo Elsinga and his son Volkert. Volkert was murdered in the largest reprisal killing in the Netherlands. 280 men and boys were taken out of different prison camps and murdered because the German governor of the Netherlands had been ambushed by the Dutch resistance. He wasn't killed, but he was terribly wounded. And in reprisal, the Germans killed 280 men. Mm-hmm. His father, Theo Elsinga, survived the war. And on the left is a picture of Anton and Cokie Sanders, who we saw their balcony earlier.
Hope I think this is a repeat here.
That's my father on the left in the late 50s at the memorial to the 10 men who were, and Dr. Alberts, who were murdered. Right by his left elbow is the word motor, M-O-E-D-I-R, which means mother. It's called the Mother Monument. And the statue that goes up at the top of the picture is a statue of a 10-year-old boy yelling mother. And he was one of the 10 that were murdered there in reprisal. And it's still there. It's been finished over the years. But on the 5th of May, which is this Sunday, the 4th of May, the Day of the Remembrance of the Dead, all over the Netherlands, every place where there's a monument and a memorial to the murdered civilians, at 8 o'clock, well, there's flowers and candles put there. And at 8 o'clock, the entire nation comes to a 2-minute quiet stop. And it's a very, very powerful 2 minutes when a whole nation comes to a quiet stop in honor and in memory of those who were killed.
A couple of years ago, we had a Dutchman on who had written a book about 3 men from the 101st Airborne. He was actually in the Dutch military, and he was relating the same point, Jim.
Yes.
And it's yeah. What are we looking at here?
Yeah, this is a little ferry boat. I put this in the story at the time where my dad would take a ferry across the Noord River in Rotterdam to a little island called Noorder Island. And there was a gin distillery on that island. And one of the resistance members he met lived in the distillery, and he would go over there and drink gin with the fella. and it was coming back on this ferry after curfew one evening when he encountered the policeman coming up the dike steps.
So eventually your father, after 5 months, does get caught. And are these the people
yes
perpetrated that?
Yeah, 3 times the Dutch tried to get him on an escape route out of the country, and 2 times they were failures. The 3rd time he was put on a route taken to a town called Breda, which is on the border between Belgium and the Netherlands, and taken out in the country to a little creek bed, and 2 Dutch marechaussées, they were Dutch border patrolmen, who met him, said, across this little creek, you are in Belgium, go in and lay down in a field, and a young girl will come with 2 bicycles and take you to Antwerp. So they did that. My father met another Canadian airman who showed up at the same time to come with him. And they laid in a field, and sure enough, this young girl who is depicted on the right there, Maria Verholz-Ooms, Anna, she came and picked them up, and she said, I'm going to take you to Antwerp, and where you're going to meet the big guy, who's the guy on the upper left, and he's going to get you into France and on into Spain. Well, at that point in the escape line, it was a false line. The Germans had created that line, and they called it the Airman's Sluice. And my father was one of 250 some airmen who were put on that line and eventually captured by René von Mylum, the guy on the left, in Antwerp. Now, the picture on the lower left is of Pauline Fleming. She was a Dutch Nazi. She and René von Mylum, above her, had an apartment in Antwerp, and that's where my father was taken. And they were both traitors. And Maria, the picture on the right, this is a picture of her after the war. She was caught, and she's in a police station right here, ready to go to trial, and she commits suicide. And my father felt so sorry for her. She was just a 19-year-old young girl, and he said that she just got swept up in the glamour of the occupiers, you know, they wined and dined her, and she really didn't know what she was doing. But the gal on the left, Pauline Fleming, did know what she was doing. And so she was caught, and that's her other picture there is 5 years in prison.
Oh.
And she should have been hung. She was responsible for about 20 Belgian helpers and Dutch helpers being murdered by the Germans as the Canadians were coming through. René von Mylum sent her out to locate all the Dutch and Belgian helpers because they wanted to kill them before the Canadians got a hold of them and would expose their whole operation. Now, René von Mylum was eventually caught because he was a stupid idiot. He ran into Germany when the Canadians overran Belgium, and toward the end of the war, he made his way back to Camp Lucky Strike as a bartender at Camp Lucky Strike, where some of the ex-POWs were coming through, and they recognized him as the guy, the big boss who was responsible for their capture. So, of course, he was tried and condemned to death and executed. So this is my father at Stalag Luft III. Eventually, a lot of your folks have heard about, and Masters of the Air gives a great part of the story of where they go through the transitions camp at Stalag Luft and end up at Stalag Luft III. But what's interesting about this picture, if you look closely, my dad's glaring out of the right side of his eyes at a German guard who's leaning right up against to his shoulder. And the German guard had just hit my dad with the butt of his rifle because my dad was acting contrary to every time the guy would try to take his picture, he would sneeze and screw up the negative. And after 3 of those, the German guard was screaming at him and whacked him with the rifle butt. And instead of sneezing again, my dad decided to just glare at him on the outside of his eyes.
That's the story John Orloff wanted. I told him about that story and what happened with the ID. I really thought he was going to use that, Masters.
Yeah, it would have been great. But the reason why my dad was carrying on like that is he said as they were lined up to have their locator cards and these ID card pictures taken, there was a B-24 up above being harassed and shot at by German airplanes, and he knew the hell that was going on with those airmen, and it really ticked him off. Long time after Stalag Luft III is evacuated and they go on the long march to Stalag 7A, this is the day, this is a picture during Liberation Day, April 29th, 1945 at Stalag 7A, just outside of Moosburg. My father on the left and another B-24 pilot, Andy Anderson, on the right. My father had gotten out of camp, went for a walk after the liberation that morning, and one of the soldiers he met gave him a camera, and so he was able to come back in and have some pictures taken. So they were very special pictures to be able to have. Yeah. This is one of them. My father on the left and Anderson on the right. They took the bunch of doors off the barracks because the barracks were so disgusting with lice and fleas and bed bugs that they couldn't live in them anymore. So they built this little tent, and they're actually posing this. He's posing here, spinning a Kriegi stove, pretending that they're cooking up something. But over on the right, you can see some Red Cross parcels. And then behind the wire, you can see some other fellows cooking up some tea or heating some things.
They called those either smokeless cookers or cookless smokers because there's smoke in the camp from these things, and they worked well, but it took 2 men to work them.
Yeah, that impeller wheel was like a blower. My dad said you could burn anything in those little cans. Yeah. But my father is a guy with his hands in his pockets, and one of these soldiers here is who gave him a camera. And as they walked out of camp into Moosburg, they saw a lot of these soldiers sitting, waiting for the bridge over the Yser River to be rebuilt by an engineering company. And all during this time, there was shelling going on back and forth between the Americans and the Germans on the other side of the Yser River. There was so much chaos in that right after liberation, and other POWs stole all of the food, the Red Cross parcels by their door tent, that he and Andy Anderson decided not to stick around and be repatriated, which took a couple weeks. And so they took off on foot to go up to northern France. And the first night, about 10 miles north of Moosburg, or Stalag 7A, they came to a farmhouse, ended up being the family Crichton device, because there were still Germans all up in the woods and in the country. And so my dad wanted to get off the road at night. And in the morning, the left picture, he had Andy Anderson take his picture in the doorway of the Crichton device family. And in 59, my dad came back and met the family. And the picture on the right is the picture in the doorway. And you can see the little girl on the left has grown up as a teenager now. And then in 94, my father went back and met them and stood in the same doorway. And now the little girl is a grown woman. And I have a color picture of myself standing in that doorway about 7 years ago when I went back and met them on our Kriege trip.
That's terrific.
Yeah, more than 7 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
All this from this famous vault that I've heard.
The vault.
We love the vault.
Vault of all this incredible memorabilia. That's
Yeah, my father kept everything, and he was just a young man when he got home, but he brought everything with him, and then all the things that the War Department sent my grandma and grandpa were hung on to also, all the telegrams and things that all of our parents got, once they were shot down and missing in action, and then finally repatriated paperworks. So because of that, we ended up having what we called the Keeffe Vault, and I still find things in there that are of great interest to people like Carol and Marilyn and others of the big family.
Then he sends them to me for the newsletter, and I never know what I'm going to get. It's just titled "From the Vault," the Keeffe. Amazing things.
Questions from the audience? Anything in the chat?
I'm enthralled by this story. Absolutely enthralled. Susan, you asked, this is great. How were you able to track these people down? How'd you do it?
Well, as we were growing up, we were a military family also. My dad went into the Air Force and retired lieutenant colonel. But three times while we were growing up as kids, he would take off for a couple months and go back to Europe in 1959 and the early 70s and the 90s. So he found out what happened to all these people and kept in touch with them. And his mind was like a photographic memory anyway. And that's how we knew all the addresses, the street corners, the agent names, all the Dutch names. It was photographic memory, and yet he just wouldn't write it down. And so that became my job. And now that all those folks are all gone now, I have met some of the offspring of some of the Dutch folks that he met during the war, and we've had this attachment ever since. The Cordelon family, where he hid in the rabbit hutch that first day, I've been back to the Cordelons, the grandson and his family, Jacques and Plooney Cordelon, great people. And it's just one big family now. And so that's how he knew what happened to everybody. And when I told him I was going to not just make a memoir of his story, but publish a book because of the Dutch part of it, I needed to let people know how amazingly brave these Dutch young resistance men and women were. When he found out I was going to publish a story, he goes, "Okay, Jim, 3 things. You got to prove everything I've told you. You've got to not embellish me, and you've got to tell the truth." And so the proving everything he told me sent me on 9 years of going to Holland, Germany, England, the Dutch archives, Poland, the camp, the Air Force archives at Colorado Springs. And almost everything he said was factual. The only thing that turned out not true was one of the Dutch people who my dad was told after the war was a German sympathizer was not a German sympathizer. And so in my first printing of the book, I said that this fellow was a German sympathizer, but I was able to correct it in future printings.
What a remarkable man your father was. And I've been looking at George Zwijgstra from the Netherlands, certainly knew a lot of people in the Dutch resistance. His own family was very involved. And I just know how much your story means to him, just, listening. Can I ask you this question, Jim? And I'm sorry if I'm stepping on your agenda here, Glenn. This story that you're sharing and that you work so hard on is not just a piece of history. It's not just family lore, but I get the sense with so many people involved that there was a quality of healing that this project may have brought to, say, your family and to the other families who were, the word is traumatized by the war. I think that there's a very big spiritual mission that you must have felt yourself on.
You're so right. And on the other side of that coin, it affected me. And I've talked to other people who've really delved into the horrors of occupation and the concentration camps and the murders and the reprisals. And it has affected me forever in a negative way.
Yes.
I still cry when I think of some of these people and the hell that they went through. But the appreciation of even going through that hell, knowing that their whole families, if they had got caught with an Allied pilot in their home, the whole family would have been put against a wall and shot. And they still took care of people like my father and hundreds of other Allied airmen. On one side, it broke my heart to understand all this. And on the other side, there's an appreciation that I could never thank them enough about.
And an admiration. How do these heroes do it? How do they do it? Ed Cavo asks, how accurate was the depiction of the interrogations, knowing so much of the POWs? If you've seen Masters of the Air, if accurate, how did the Germans get the info on the POWs so quickly?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, that's Ed Cavo has put this in the chat here, and I think we've talked about it in past programs. But I know Colin and Marilyn know all about that.
Yeah, they had a big archive, you might call it, at Stalag Luft at the interrogation center. It was called BUNA. Colin might know the full name or to pronounce it. And they kept scraps of everything. And as a man would be coming in, being interrogated, the Luftgau would bring all these men from the crash site in, and they would search the plane and take everything, little bits of things they weren't supposed to fly with, Social Security cards, cards for their meals, and their pictures were taken, and maybe one bomb group had the same outfit on every man, or he went through a line with somebody had a strange pencil to mark off his tickets when he had a meal.
Or laundry.
Or laundry, yeah, meals or laundry. And all they saw that's all they had to see. They knew what bomb group they were from. And they had a clipping service where they would take all the information from local newspapers. When a man went off to war, his parents might have an article about the background, anything they could find to present to the person, the man that they were interrogating. They were just stunned by what they knew, but it was just a massive system, wasn't it, Colin? And I mean, it probably looked like a flea market in there, and just every little thing that could serve some kind of an intelligence, they took advantage of that. And they did have some spies in England and as well too. So they got past information. It was, as far as Masters of the Air goes, the interrogation scene was pretty accurate, and the fact that they did know so much. Yeah, that was accurate. That was not made up.
Yeah, yeah. The Abwehr, German intelligence, had between 5 and 6,000 Germans who were native English speakers in the U.S. alone, who spoke without an accent because they were born in the U.S.
Yeah.
And they had them canvassing. They had one guy was an editor at a newspaper in Wichita, Kansas. So he would pick up the wires of all the national newspapers, and he was sending all that stuff to Wilhelm Canaris, who was head of the Abwehr. Canaris was sitting on it because he was anti-Hitler and was part of the plot to kill him. But when Reinhard Gehlen took over, he said, "Oh, this is a treasure trove." So that's how they got a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
You know, if I may, when my dad was with the Alberts family, he wrote a letter back to his mother in Seattle saying everything's fine, I'm on vacation, we're doing well. And it had the Alberts address on that letter. Well, my mom knew it was my dad's signature. He didn't sign it, Jim Keeffe. He signed it a fake name, but she knew it was his signature. So she said to her husband, "Jim's alive. He's alive." So my dad goes to the Seattle Times and writes a story, and that's printed in the paper saying, Lieutenant Keeffe's alive in Holland, working with the resistance.
Oh,
and
God,
so
good.
for years after the war, after the Joppa Alberts were captured, my dad was worried that it was because of that article in the paper that got back to the Germans, because they had every paper in the United States every day was given to them, like Colin said.
Right.
But it ended up not being that article that ended up getting the family captured. It was a traitor that did it.
Mm. Interesting.
Todd, in the interest of time, we need to finish with Jim and move on to Carol.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we get Carol's stories in because it's equally as compelling.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
But Todd, why don't we do like the 1 minute station break?
Okay, 1 minute station break. Here we go. Yes, this is the Veterans Breakfast Club, and we have been doing events like this, having veterans share stories for 16 years, mainly in Western Pennsylvania, but elsewhere also. Our next in-person event is coming up on Saturday, and that's at the University of Pittsburgh at Greensburg campus. I looked at our roster today. We have 65 people scheduled for that event so far, and man, do we have some good stories lined up. Please join us if you can. If you're in Western Pennsylvania, would love to have you. That's Saturday, May 4th at 8:30 a.m. We will be back doing open conversation Monday night at 7 p.m. Eastern. I have a few things that I want to talk about. We're asking Bob Connor, if you remember him, the Vietnam veteran. He's coming in to share a breaking news story about a POW MIA whose grave has been discovered in Vietnam. Almost certainly his grave. There's a witness that he was a POW marched to a remote camp. He died when he arrived there and was buried right there, and we have a witness. So please join us Monday, 7 p.m. I want to thank Tobacco Free Adagio Health for sponsoring our program. They are dedicated to preventing and reducing tobacco use, educating people about tobacco hazards, and advocating for healthier places to live, work, and play. You can find out more about Tobacco-Free Adagio Health by going to tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org. I also have to say they have a wonderful counseling line if you want to quit smoking, 1-800-QUIT-NOW. That's 1-800-QUIT-NOW. We also want to thank UPMC for Life for sponsoring this program. They do it every week. They can help you make sense of Medicare, get the answers and information you need, such as how to choose the Medicare Advantage plan that's right for you. UPMC for Life has plans designed by veterans for veterans. I actually happen to know the veteran who designed a plan that they're offering right now for TRICARE for Life holders. They can save you money and get you more benefits, and you can view all their plan options by going to upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. So thank you again for joining us. We're the Veterans Breakfast Club. We publish a quarterly magazine, and actually we're going to dedicate our summer issue, which we're working on now, to these Masters of the Air stories that we've been hearing over the past several months. This is our spring edition. We send this out to 9,300 households around the country, print up another 7,500 more for hand distribution. These are just free of charge. We like to send them to as many people as we can. If you don't receive it, it's because we don't have your address. And if you would like to receive it, let me know. send me an email, Todd, T-O-D-D, at veteransbreakfastclub.org. We also have a survey, 2.5 minutes. How would you think about the program? How could we improve? I will put the link to that survey in the chat. Okay, back to you, Glenn.
Okay, thank you. Jim, thank you very much. What
Oh, thank you all. It's been a pleasure.
Great story in so many different ways, and what fantastic work you've done for your family and your father to honor them. Okay, so now we're going to get to if I do it where it's why won't let's do that. There we are. Okay, Carol.
Yes,
Thank you for hanging in there for the last
certainly.
bit of time. So, Carol, this is your father, First Lieutenant William Pershing Carey.
That's correct.
Love that middle name, Pershing. Remind me why, how he came to have that
Yes.
name?
Well, Dad was born in Brooklyn on November 11th, 1918, Armistice Day, and his mother was so glad the war ended that she gave his middle name to be Pershing, to honor General Pershing. So that's how he ended up with that name.
Great.
Mhm.
So, when did your father join the Air Force, the Army Air Force?
Well, his family moved from Brooklyn to Miami, Florida, and he went through school there, and he went to the University of Florida, and he was in the ROTC program at the University of Florida, and ended up being in the field or the horse-drawn artillery. And he decided he didn't want to be on the ground with the horses, he wanted to be in the sky. So he was able to switch and get into aviation, and went through the program, through all the steps that you did at that time, and then came into the Army Air Corps at that point.
That's quite a jump from almost Civil War sort of technology,
Yes,
horses, to the most modern
absolutely.
technology.
He figured he was safer in the air, but oh well.
Well, we ended up not using any horses, but there were horses in the U.S. Army right up until 1940, 41.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
There were 2 cavalry regiments in the U.S. Army in 1940. So, yeah, things changed fast.
Yes, they do.
So this is your father, I suppose.
In his flight suit, yes. As all B-17 pilots must have worn the same outfits.
Yeah, what a great. Is it a painting or a photograph? It's a photograph.
It's a photograph. It's a photograph. He sent it to his sister.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'm not sure where it was taken.
So this is going to be where we get into the twist in your father's story, which is so different from so many other of the B-17 pilots who flew and were captured. So, and this story is kind of hazy. This is Fort Hunt, and that is where
It's just outside of Alexandria, Virginia. It's across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. And it's a national park now. But I think we're kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but it was would you like me to explain a little?
A little bit. I think it's just the background that would help.
Okay.
Secret base known as P.O. Box 1142. And what went on there?
Well, during World War II, there was a very highly secretive organization, only a very few in the U.S. government military knew about. And it was patterned after MI9 that the British had developed. And it was called Military Intelligence Security -X. The X stood for escape. And while airmen were still in the United States during their training period, volunteers were asked to be trained in this covert activity that would help POWs if the pilot ever was captured and put in a POW camp. He would be able to engage in different activities, whatever it was he was trained in, within the POW camp. And my father volunteered. He was trained to be an MISX code user, and he learned to write codes and to receive codes. But what his job was in the camp, and this was all, no one knew about it, he was given a code to give to the senior American officer in the camp where he was captured and put as a POW that would alert the commander that he had a special job to do within the POW community. That way, the commander would be able to let him be moved throughout the camp or the whatever stalag he was in to proceed with the task that he had learned to do. So my dad was trained to interview all the new incoming airmen that had been captured and brought into Stalag Luft III. And in that process, he was supposed to learn if they were really American airmen or if they were imposters, and get as much information from them as he could. He needed to get information from whatever source he could get it from. And in order to do that, he had to be moved between different camps. Now, Stalag Luft.
So, Carol, let me stop you there, because I the timeline is a little odd here. We're going to do like movies do, and that's jump back and forth time in the chronology of the story. Okay. So the point, I guess, that I was trying to make with the picture of Fort Hunt was that it existed, that it was there, and that those activities took place there. And although you don't think your father was physically at this Fort Hunt, he was trained in the MISX coding. So
right.
let's hold
but
on.
The only purpose of the Fort Hunt location was a building in which craftsmen worked to fill the needs of what POWs needed in camp. They needed radio parts, they needed compasses, they needed uniforms, they needed Deutschmarks, they needed all the things that a POW would need in order to successfully escape and evade in Germany and countries occupied. So that's what a very secretive building did, and it just happened to be located at Fort Hunt. Fort Hunt had been in existence for many, many years through different wars. It guards the Potomac approach to Washington, D.C. So it was in a convenient location near Washington, D.C., but it was there was a very small structure there that had to do with the tasks that my father was involved in. There was also German POWs that were kept there. So there were several different jobs that the location was involved in.
But to get back to the timeline of your father's experience, so he is sent to England, and he's a member of is it the 95th bomber group?
No, he was in the 92nd bomb group, and he was at Alconbury, England.
And these are some photos of him and the plane that he flew, the Busy Betsy, is that it?
Busy Betsy, yes.
Yeah, okay.
This would have been the plane he would have flown over from the States to England.
And do you recall how many missions he flew before he was shot down?
No, I do not, because he was shot down. At the time, there were no fighters that could go as deep into Germany as was needed to protect the bomber. So the Army Air Corps had an experiment conducted. They wanted to conduct an experiment to see if they took the bombs out of the B-17s and reconfigured it and used it as more of a fighter. So that he volunteered to participate in this experiment, and he flew a YB-40, which was a reconfigured B-17, on a bombing run to Hulls, Germany, which was a synthetic rubber plant. And it was on that mission that he was shot down because the YB-40 that he was flying was very heavily loaded with armament, with guns, to act as a fighter would. When the bombers released their bombs, they became very light, would rise up, could turn around and fly back to England. But the YB-40 was still very heavy because they didn't release any of their weight. They still had all the guns and the ammunition, and they were a sitting duck for the flak. Dad said that the flak was so heavy he could have gotten out and walked on it back to England, but of course he didn't.
So this is something that was new information to me, this YB-40 program. And I find it interesting that, in effect, they loaded up a B-17, reconfigured it with a lot more firepower, put it up there with the bomber stream in an effort to try to help with the defense of the bomber stream.
But it didn't work.
No.
They found that it did not work.
Right.
So they scrubbed that idea.
So I'm just interested from our audience. We have a lot of experts on the 8th Air Force in the audience. Had anybody else been aware of this YB-40 program? If you have, just speak up. I'd be fascinated to know if someone else had heard of this.
Yes.
I have.
I knew you would, Colin. I knew it was going to be Colin.
Well, let Marilyn go first because she's my friend. So go.
Oh, you probably know more about it than I do. It's just reading in journals. Joe Moser, who was held at Buchenwald, he also flew one of these very planes too. I forget how many missions he was on, and that's when I first became familiar with it. And I think Carol's covered it pretty well. Actually, Colin can probably tell you more. I had seen it. I knew it was reconfigured B-17 and that it didn't last very long because of what Carol has already said. It wasn't a good plane to be flying.
Yeah, the YB-40 concept came about because of Curtis LeMay and Ira Aker. Curtis LeMay, who I knew very well and interviewed him, his interview's in one of my books. Curtis LeMay said, and I won't use his exact language because if you know about Curtis LeMay, he was colorful. But he told Ira Aker, as a colonel, he told Ira Aker that you must have your head up, whatever, because if you think that we're going to be surviving these trips to Germany without fighters, you're an idiot. And with all due respect, sir, you can drop me in rank and court-martial me, but if you don't throw some superior firepower up there, we're going to have an issue. So Ira Aker said, okay, well, we'll work it out. And they took the B-17s and threw about 18 to 20 guns on the thing, and that's how it came out.
Wow.
18 to 20. Jeez.
Yeah. Again, I'm just fascinated by the story and fascinated by the thought that your father volunteered to fly one of these. So, did I put the share back up, by the way?
Yeah.
No. Okay.
I can see it.
Okay. So, Carol, back to your father's story. He's shot down June 22nd of 43.
Correct.
In one of these YB-40s, he becomes a prisoner of war. I imagine he went through the typical interrogation process.
Yes.
Stalag Luft III.
Stalag Luft. He went through there in Oberursel. And just to follow up one of the points made earlier from Jim, that Dad had told me, and in some of his notes, that one of the people that interviewed him spoke perfect American English, and he had graduated from the University of Chicago. So the Germans had a lot of very Americanized interrogators at Oberursel that would really put very difficult questions to the airmen that came through there. I think the anxiety of going through that process was part of what really got to Dad. When he jumped out of the plane, he went back to make sure all of his crewmen had gotten out of the plane. And to Jim's father saying a Hail Mary, my dad got at the bomb bay door, ready to jump, and realized, oh gosh, I don't have my parachute on. So he had to go back up to the cockpit, put his parachute on, and go back and jump out. When he jumped out, he landed and was met by 30 of Hitler Youth, organized. They all had pitchforks, and they were under the control of the local police from where he landed. So he was quickly ushered off to interrogate and then eventually trained over to Stalag Luft III. So when he got to Stalag Luft III, he made it known to the American senior officer that he had a special task to do within the POW camp. And because he had this special training as a MISX code user, he was put within a cadre of men that could be moved from camp to camp. Now, Stalag Luft III had a number of individual camps. North Camp, South Camp, Center Camp, various camps that he was able to infiltrate and get into and start to interrogate people as well as train individuals in escape and evasion. He tried to get information from anybody he could, and the information he gleaned from interviewing various people, he would put in coded letters that were covert letters to a girlfriend in the States. Well, this girlfriend wasn't really a girlfriend. It was his handler at the Military Intelligence Service. And in these coded letters, the code users would request items that the POWs needed to prepare for and to escape with that would assure more success in their escape. He said that many people wanted to escape, but not everyone was physically fit or had the mannerisms they could blend in with the German community. Now, these pictures that you're showing are some of the items that were built and smuggled into existing items at Fort Hunt in...
What's in the Camel cigarette box?
I'm not sure what that...
Parts. Is it radio parts? Maybe earphones?
It might be, but I'm not real sure what that particular one is. Marilyn sent me that picture, so I'm not real sure what that is.
That looks like a Morse code transceiver receiver.
It might be, but some of the things that, again, at Fort Hunt, there was a building in which craftsmen, very highly skilled craftsmen, would build or reconfigure items like baseballs that would have a core center that might have maps or...
Picture one there.
Right there, or have radio parts or compasses. Compasses were embedded in buttons. There's shaving brushes at the time. The handles would be opened, hollowed out, and maps would be included inside, and then they would be very finely put back together and glued with a special iron glue, so they only could be opened if they were crushed. Because they had to go through inspection once they came into the POW facility. The Germans had to inspect different items that would come in the mail. But the interesting part about how these items got from the United States to Germany, I think, is part of a very important part of the story. We all know about the Red Cross packages. Those were could not be infiltrated. Those had to be legitimately sent from the Red Cross, because that meant life or death to many POWs because of the food and the items that they provided. So false organizations had to be created, and this is what MI9 did, and the MISX patterned after that. They created organizations that appeared to be doing similar things for the imprisoned airmen. And they were titled titles such as Airmen's Relief Society, something like that. So they would send 3 different types of packages. The first type of package would be a totally food-oriented package. The second type would be clothing. The third type would be games or entertainment activities like baseballs and Monopoly and cards, etc. That package, the one with the games, would be the loaded packages. And by loaded, I mean they're the ones where maps would be made at the factory, where the maps that were needed were laminated on the back of the Monopoly board playing surface. So between this, what you're seeing on the screen, and what your playing service would be. And this was helped by the company that makes the Monopoly games. So the government had relationships with certain companies that made a game or made cards that could laminate a map. So when all the 52 cards are put together, you had a map. So they had agreements within these companies that would help. They also had an agreement with the U.S. Postal Service of how to mail them and get them to where they needed to go, with special supervisors in the post office service that would only 2 supervisors in the DC area would be able to stamp and secure these packages in the mail to get to the destination they were to go to. And one of the jobs my dad had was to go in the dark of night under the searchlights at Stalag Luft III and Center Camp and go into the mailroom and break in there and retrieve the packages that were coded, that only he knew what the codes were. So he could retrieve the packages and take them back to the barracks and then open them and distribute them to the appropriate people within each of these MIS trained individuals. They were very compartmentalized. One would be working in coding, another would be working in forgery, another would be working in making German uniforms or civilian clothing. So when there was an escape, the escapees would have the appropriate clothing and monies and maps for their journey.
Wow. And the Germans, did they capture some of this material as it came in?
No, they didn't. As far as I know, from what I was told and what I have read, they did not. The Germans during the day in the mail rooms, they would have to inspect different packages, but they had a way, the POWs had a way of distracting or moving items, or that's why my father would go in the dark of night into the mail room, the main mail room, and retrieve the packages that he knew had the items in that he had requested.
And at great personal risk to himself.
Absolutely at great personal risk. In his later years, he had PTSD, and he would become very upset when he would hear sirens or when the fire alarm would go off in their condominium complex. I mean, it would just bring back the memories of the sirens in the camp and the searchlights, etc. And I'm sure many, many airmen had similar reactions.
Wow. And when did all this become known to the public? I take it not.
Well, I know for a fact because in 1996, I was living in the DC area and my parents came to visit, and Dad was very interested in finding out where he had been debriefed by his MISX code handler. And we couldn't determine anything that time. I think President Clinton was the one who allowed some of this information to become public, but not all of it. There's still a lot of these processes that are utilized. So today, I mean, a lot of these secretive things that were done during World War II in this particular program that were not, they didn't want them to become totally public for everyone to know about. So he never talked about it. So what I've learned since his passing is from my research and meeting with other POW children who had similar experiences, because these gentlemen had to take their secret to the grave.
Yeah. Wow. What another story of extreme courage and sacrifice to do this.
Just as many did. Dad was in Stalag Luft III when the Great Escape occurred. And he wasn't involved in that, but he was involved in the repercussions of it because of what happened to the people who did escape and how they were rounded up and Hitler had them murdered. From then forward, there were only 2 people allowed to escape at a time. And they had to be very well equipped and very able to blend in and speak the language and minimize the chances of them being captured. Dad escaped several times from Stalag Luft III, was captured, took back into the camp and put in another, when I say camp, back into pardon?
Compound.
Different compound. And that by doing that, he was captured after he was caught from his escape. He was brought back in, put in solitary confinement for 2 weeks, and then moved to another compound. And that's how he was able to maneuver from compound to compound and train different people within these different compounds. One of the escapes was traced back to him, someone who was captured, either the money or the uniform or whatever, and he got another visit to the cooler for another 2 weeks. So he moved around a lot within Stalag Luft III.
Let's pause here, Carol, to allow our audience to ask any questions. Anything in the chat that we should address, Todd?
Yes, there are. Greg Yost asked a good question. Were any of these trainees deliberately dropped off in Germany? Their planes deliberately crashed so that they could become POWs and perform these missions? Or did the U.S. just figure that the law of averages would get enough of these trainees into POW camps?
I would have to say the law of averages. I mean, the whole purpose of the program was, if you are captured, you know what to do when you are in a POW camp.
Yeah.
This is your task.
Right.
It would be interesting to know, and I don't think we know, Marilyn or Carol, how many of these men were trained in such a way, and then how many actually, made it into a POW camp.
Well, it's interesting because the trainees never revealed that they had the training. No one ever talked about any of it. It was all that's totally sworn to secrecy. The only indication that the senior American officer had was a simple code that the trainee would give to the senior American officer to say, I have a special skill that I am supposed to do while I'm a POW. And that way, it was General Clark, who was Dad's superior.
He was a coder too. Yeah, Clark.
Yeah, he was a coder too. But interestingly, when my father returned after the war, he met in his business. He left the Air Force in the mid-50s, but he met some fellow businessmen who eventually found out they were a coder as well. So you didn't know till maybe someone said something later when you agreed the two of you were coders, and it's just a very interesting happenstance.
Carol, Bob Flage from Jacksonville, Florida, Vietnam veteran, asked, did your father catch any imposters? And if so, how were they treated? Ignored or isolated?
Because Dad didn't talk about those things, I can't answer that question. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it takes you back to, I think, the better prisoner of war movie, Stalag 17, with William Holden, right?
Yeah.
Recall that. The better than The Great Escape, although The Great Escape is...
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Great Escape is sort of more fun to watch, if you will, but...
But not all of it was 100% accurate.
Yeah.
But you know what's crazy? The Germans did a lot of efforts to infiltrate the POW camps with imposters. But the British and Americans, we never did that because we just bugged them. We put electronic bugs in their rooms.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that still puzzles me is we know that General Patton's Third Army liberated Stalag 7A in Moosburg on the 29th of April, 1945. But Dad had information that he needed to relay before the chaos of liberation. So he escaped successfully from Moosburg on April 6, 1945, and evaded to Paris to be debriefed for the first time with allies there. What I want to know and would like to research further is how did he get to Paris? I mean, what network helped him evade successfully to get there? Because he'd already escaped several times and it was so chaotic, he went back in because it was much less, it was better inside than it was in the outside, just because people knew that liberation was coming and you couldn't get anywhere. So once he got to Paris, was debriefed, he was flown back to DC for his final debrief. But I want to know how he got to Paris.
Yeah, it's interesting because SS were in that area at that time in April, before liberation, and the final skirmishes were with the SS as well. So it was a miracle he did get out at the time.
Maybe he met the Kreidenweiss family.
Maybe he did.
They were everywhere.
Yeah.
We don't know.
Other questions from our audience?
Nancy Smoyer asks a good question. Why weren't the repeat escapees executed? That wasn't the practice.
Well,
They
eventually.
were normally sent away to other camps sometimes too. Sachsenhausen, after the greatest,
Yeah.
some of them went to
Okay.
Sachsenhausen.
Was that the name of the famous camp that where they held these high-risk prisoners? Was that Castle of some
Oh,
kind?
no, that was,
Oh.
no, I've been there.
Holditz.
That was
That was
cold.
Colditz.
That's
Hold
it.
it.
Yeah, Bader
Yeah.
was there, the legless pilot from,
Right.
they held him there. He escaped all the time with,
Again,
No.
these were officers, and they treated officers differently than enlisted. They had high respect for them, and their tolerance was probably greater.
Yeah.
It brings to mind a question, if I could, of Jim that I had before, but I didn't want to interrupt. When your father was captured, was he worried that he'd be shot as a spy? Was that a consideration? I would have
Well,
thought.
he was not at the time, but after he was in camp for a while, he met a fella in his combine. And by the way, he was in combine 49, just right behind your dad's, Carol.
Yeah, because Dad was in 39.
Yeah. And so anyway, when he was in the camp, Stalag Luft III, he met a man who had been beat to a catatonic state. He had to be helped with his clothes and helped with food. And my dad befriended him and walked around, and everyone was saying, yeah, the Germans brought him in. He was a crashed P-47 pilot. His face was all destroyed. Anyway, eventually Davy Walter came back to the living, and he told my father, no, he was a B-17 pilot who crashed in France, spent time with the French resistance, and then was captured, and the Gestapo tortured him to find out who the French resistance people were he stayed with. When my dad found that out is when he started getting nightmares that if the Germans found out I've been in Holland for 5 months, even though when he was captured in Antwerp, the Germans said, we have all the names of the Dutch people who you've been staying with, and you read them off. But it went into the Abwehr. He was caught by the Abwehr intelligence services. And my dad knew that if it was any other intelligence service, he would have been destroyed right then and there. Yeah. But because it was the Abwehr, he wasn't. But when he found out what happened to Davy Walter, he started getting nightmares. And he went to Colonel Spivey, who was at that time lead commander of Center Compound, and told him. And so they started having, they were, if the Germans ever came in and asked him for him, he would have been a ghost. They would have hid him and taken care of him that way, but that never happened.
Just so you know, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who ran the Abwehr, he protected the Allied pilots. He protected allies who would have been otherwise executed.
That's probably why my dad knew that he was a lucky man being caught by them and not anybody else.
So, Todd, we're running up against we're past our quit time. These stories, we could go on for a long time, but we have to respect.
I'm in awe of the stories, but I'm also in awe of the unbelievable knowledge we have in this Zoom room. I mean, it's just absolutely fascinating that y'all should write a book, and they have. So so thank you all for devoting so much of your time and expertise to our programming. We really all greatly benefit from it. Thank you.
You're very
And-
welcome.
It's wonderful to be part of your crowd.
Certainly is.
Well, we hope you keep coming back, Jim and Carol, and I know Marilyn will. We've got her.
Oh, yeah.
We've got her captured.
I've
Yes.
got more people for you.
And
Cream of the crop, as you can see.
I see Nancy Putman on the screen, and I just want to promote our program next week with Nancy Putman and a couple of the other 100th Bomb Group families. And thank Nancy for helping put that together. We've kind of become great friends with many of the 100th Bomb Group Foundation people. I see Jim Blakely there. And it just is another great group of people to get to know. Thank you so
Yes.
very much.
truly a great group of people. Truly a
Bless
great
you
group of
all.
people. Man, fantastic. And Colin Heaton, I'm just telling you right now, if when we do our Jeopardy game again, you are not permitted to play. So sorry,
You'll win every time.
it would not be fair. So all right.
And bless you, Julia, and you, George.
He's my partner on Trivial Pursuit.
Oh my gosh. Amazing. All right. All right.
Thanks,
Good night,
everybody.
everybody. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Have
Good
a
night.
wonderful weekend. Take care. See you next